A very, very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world today. It is so good to have you along for this webinar. My name is Colette Wong. I'm your MC, and I'll be guiding you along this webinar over the next 90 minutes. Now, this program is jointly organized by the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change and ClientEarth. Two complementary investor guides to support corporate engagement for net zero transition in the region will be introduced, and that will be followed by a panel discussion on delivering effective, robust, and impactful corporate engagements on climate issues. Just one housekeeping note that you should be aware of. If you have any questions during this webinar, simply type it into the Q&A function, which is in the Zoom panel. So without further ado, I will now pass this on to Rebecca Mikula-Wright, the Chief Executive Officer of AIGCC, for her welcome remarks. Rebecca, it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Colette, and welcome everyone today. Great to be on this webinar with you and the launch and going through these guides. So as we of course all know that Asia is uniquely exposed to extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. And while there is a concentration of climate risks, we also know that there is the biggest opportunity in Asia from the transition to cleaner economies. Governments in the region are acutely aware of the mitigation and adaptation measures that are required to limit the global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And of course, there is a critical role in the financial sector, which is what we're here to talk about today. This includes the role for institutional investors, in line with their fiduciary duty to exercise their stewardship responsibilities, while they continue to receive increasing regulatory encouragement in the form of stewardship codes and other instruments. There is regulatory acknowledgement that investors play a significant role in mobilising finance at the scale needed to achieve Paris Agreement goals. So engagement on climate by investors in Asia is no longer a novelty that it once was a couple of years ago, and it's now a widely accepted form of stewardship. So increasing collaborative initiatives to demonstrate good stewardship have emerged over recent years, including, of course, the Climate Action 100+, the AIGCC Utilities Engagement Program, including other net zero investor initiatives that obviously have engagement as part of the underlying objectives. And they all have a shared common agenda in creating frameworks and increasing expectations around investing for a net zero future and to reach these Paris-aligned climate goals through investor collaboration and in many cases through engagement with corporates as part of this. So we know that corporate engagement in climate has sharply increased globally, but also in Asia over the last few years. And with the Climate Action 100+ initiative, led by investors, now has over 700 investors who are responsible for 68 trillion in assets under management. And their engagement on climate is a key expectation in the Net Zero Asset Managers initiative. So we increasingly have investors committing to net zero, and there is really a demand for practical implementation guides on approaches to corporate engagement, especially in the Asia region. So the constructive discussions in these engagement meetings and the dialogues that take place need to be guided by science and also investors' roles and responsibilities. And it's how the investors exercise their responsible stewardship and considering how they use their ownership rights to influence a company's decision-making process. Obviously, we recognise there will be different approaches in different jurisdictions, but this global momentum for engagement dialogue, needs to be complemented or needing to be complemented with shareholder proposals on climate is definitely on the increase. So we have shareholder proposals on climate change and proxy voting, along with a range of other stewardship options that can really play a complementary role to private dialogue in these broader engagement strategies. This heightened focus on engagement is also driving an increase in climate-related shareholder proposals globally, which call for strengthening climate-related disclosure, net zero transition plans, and emissions reductions targets aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Such proposals, of course, have also been filed in Japan, including by institutional investors. So these carefully considered shareholder proposals and the exercising of voting rights, along with other stewardship activities, can really complement and shape constructive engagement between institutional investors and their investee companies. So the Net Zero Engagement in Asia, a guide to shareholder climate resolutions, really is a practical reference for investors looking to understand the range of stewardship options at their disposal And we really feel that this is very complementary to the Climate Action 100 Plus Investor Guide for engaging in Asia, and really can be used in parallel to enable really effective, robust and impactful corporate engagement in Asia. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Colette. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We are so honored now to have Mr. Satoshi Ikeda, the Chief Sustainable Finance Officer at Financial Services Agency, Government of Japan, to deliver a keynote speech. Ikeda-san, please.
Thank you for that introduction. And also, thank you for having me here. Well, I'm Satoshi Ikeda, Chief Sustainable Finance Officer at Japan FSA. And it is a great honor to be present at the launch event for the Net Zero Engagement in Asia report. And I would like to congratulate all those involved with developing this insightful report. Well, transitioning to net zero requires transformation of the overall socio-economic system. And in driving the adaptation of the corporate sector in Asia to this new reality, asset owners and asset managers will need to play a huge role. And in this regard, active ownership and stewardship is a very important concept guiding them in fulfilling their duties. Well, given still a high degree of reliance on fossil fuels, and particularly coal in the overall energy system in Asia, Asia's journey to net zero is a radical transformation of the economic system itself, as well as a strategic shift of an individual company's business model. And so also Asia's supply chains are heavily exposed to climate risks. Quite a number of major business cities and critical industrial clusters in Asia located at seaside or riverside, and their vulnerability to water-related risks will only increase going forward. Plus, while Asian, global, and regional harbors must withstand the severity of storm surges and tidal waves intensified by climate change over coming decades. So the magnitude of transition risks and physical risks to which Asia as a region is exposed to is at significant level. So protecting the value of investment portfolio is a quite challenge for asset managers and asset owners, but certainly it also constitutes the part of their fiduciary duties. And this is where active ownership and stewardship must come in to assert itself as an important concept to guide actions by asset owners and asset managers. So it is critically important to change the behavior of corporate Asia as a whole. And because it is a systemic change, a whole of the economy approach will be needed. And so every entity must not be left behind in the journey to net zero in Asia. So in realizing this, engagement by asset owners and asset managers with them is essential. Engagement must be targeted towards significant change in the corporate Asia's course of action, and thereby towards the real-world impact in addressing climate-related risks. So importantly, asset owners and asset managers will not be able to escape the effects of climate-related risks on corporate Asia just by divesting from it. In the end, disruptions caused by corporate Asia's failure to address climate-related risk will ripple through the global financial markets as a result of a closely linked value chain that connect Asia with the rest of the world. But on the other hand, well, by being successful in addressing these risks, asset owners and asset managers will reap the large benefits of those successes in the end. And with that, Asia will continue to be the growth center of the global economy, benefiting from the multi-layered networks of value chains spanning throughout the region and connecting it with the rest of the world. Asia will continue to be the manufacturing hub of the global value chains, ranging from industrial products such as steel and chemical to consumer products such as smartphones and PCs. So all in all, Asia, by that, will continue to be the economic and industrial center of gravity in the world, and more importantly, continue to create wealth and jobs even under the new reality originating from physical risk and transition risks of climate change. So that is why the corporate engagement with corporate Asia by asset owners, asset managers is so important. Constructive dialogue between institutional investors and investee companies is so important. And so I hope that this report is a great addition to global conversation on this topic, and also is a very good decision useful guide for asset owners and asset managers in Asia going forward for that purpose. I hope that today's webinar will be very informative for all the participants in getting a certain guide for that course of action. Thank you.
Fantastic, Ikeda-san. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts on corporate engagements here in this region. It is now my pleasure to introduce to all of you Valerie Kwan. She's the Director of Engagements at AIGCC, to present the Climate Action 100 Plus Investor Guide for Engaging in Asia. Valerie, the screen is yours.
Thank you. So I have just shared my screen. Hopefully people can also see it. A couple of slides there, but thanks everyone, and good morning, good afternoon to depending on where you are. I think there's no need for us to reiterate the urgency on climate. That has already been covered both by Ikeda-san and by Rebecca. Very pronounced messages there. And I think for me, I'm keen to emphasize today's underpinning theme, I think, on how we create effective, robust, and impactful engagements on climate issues in Asia in particular. And to start off this conversation, a brief refresher to a report that was already being published. I think it would be helpful to use that as a precursor to the next report, which Elizabeth will be presenting in the next segment. So I'll be brief here, but to set the context for engagement, I think that will be helpful. So in AIGCC, we engage with investors to support and shape the way they engage with companies on climate issues. And we do so by building capacity amongst investors, helping them understand the landscape of engaging on climate, and creating opportunities through collaborative engagement initiatives like Climate Action 100 Plus and the Asia Utility Engagement Program, all of that to enable that peer-to-peer learning, and also more importantly to enable that collaborative engagement process. And what I think is notable as we work with investors is that in Asia, the unique challenges and opportunities that we face are not quite directly comparable with other regions. We have very diverse markets, a mix of emerging economies and developed economies, so clearly no one-size-fits-all approach would work across the region. We also have different regulatory landscapes, and within markets, we have some markets where the stewardship structures are very well established, other markets that are slightly less familiar with the idea. And so the way that market structure differs will have a pronounced impact on how company engagement might look like and how they might be typically carried out. And so for investors to truly understand those dynamics between the corporates, between investors themselves and the stakeholders, how that might differ, that is incredibly important as they go into a conversation with the companies, because they do need to know what those dynamics are and what options are available for them. So we're of the view that it's always beneficial to help investors out with supporting them with all-rounded assessments of a company's strategy, what their progress is like, what their commitment to climate change is like. And what we've learned is that there's no single tool or single scoring mechanism when being used in silo would be able to adequately assess all of that information and to assess if a company has a credible plan to transition. And for that reason, we often would point investors towards a number of resources. The Net Zero Company Benchmark by Climate Action 100 Plus, certainly that's a primary resource that we would point them towards. It allows investors to look into a company's performance on climate change and have that mapped across multiple issues that's being disclosed on. We would also point them towards the TPI management quality and carbon performance tool. It looks at a much wider universe of companies and therefore always helpful for comparability, especially when we work with engaging on emerging markets. And also, ultimately, what some investors may choose to do is that with the combination of the tools that I've mentioned, alongside with other information that might come across their way, they would combine that information and choose to use them to inform their voting decisions or to decide if they want to lend their support behind some of the selected shareholder proposals as they see fit. But ultimately in Asia, I think what's important and something that we would often reiterate is that understanding that regional nuances, understanding where that country is, as in the host country for a certain company that we're engaging in, what the regional energy roadmap might look like in the transition to net zero. All of that are important considerations for investors as they strategize on their engagement and leverage on the resources that are available. So just as a refresher on the guide that I was that was being mentioned, it was already published, available in several languages, and the key takeaway from this is that we do recognize that companies in different regions could be at different stages of their transition. And so based on that position of transition, there will be different guidance on the priorities that investors can choose to engage on. And these expectations being laid out in the report there is anchored against the net zero company benchmark. We do acknowledge that the benchmark itself is sector agnostic and market agnostic, and therefore the guide here, what it seeks to do is to translate some of these engagement asks for emerging markets for companies in these markets to take smaller but steady steps ahead. So I will encourage people to go into the guide itself, but just a quick overview of the key topics that are being addressed. We will look into the net zero commitments that companies set, their interim targets, decarbonization strategies, and whether a company has the relevant management processes and systems in place. So each of these categories are individual chapters supported by case studies and investor quotes in various shapes and forms, and so I think would be relevant for the group as well. So going on next there, overall, I think just some key takeaways from the report, other than the structure of the report itself, is that there are some common gaps and priorities that we've identified, and these gaps and common areas to engage on are a result of continued engagement on top-line ambitions from companies, and which has further opened up other avenues of engagement into the deeper and finer issues in corporate engagement. And first of all, from the perspective of having global emissions reach net zero by 2050, we do recognize that investors will need to look into the relationship between company net zero targets and that of their host country NDCs, have an understanding of what the NDCs are, and also with the understanding that it will continue to increase in ambition. Also notably on the capital alignment perspective, we're seeing companies starting to make some form of disclosure in that regard, which is good as a start, but then most of them still lack the comprehensive overview in terms of how their CapEx projects contribute to the overall company strategy in meeting their greenhouse gas reduction targets. Lobbying is also a topic that was touched on in the guide. Might not currently be a priority for some of the companies headquartered in Asia, but then it's important for us to understand that it is equally relevant and influential in terms of company influence. And so just a few key items to pick out of the report, but certainly there's a lot more for people to look at. Another thing that people might be interested to look into is, in particular, the feedback through interviews that we have gathered from investors who supported the report by giving us those interviews and offering us those quotes and insights in the case studies. And I think we can characterize that into a couple of key features for successful engagements, just going back to the underpinning theme for today. In terms of ensuring effectiveness of the engagements, the ability to maintain an open dialogue with the company, that is particularly important. There's no point in continuing the engagement if the conversation is completely closed. And for that reason, some of the investors have been quite keen on emphasizing the point of the need to escalate the level of the conversation with in terms of the seniority between both the investors and the corporate in these conversations with the companies on climate. Also, to take note, if the company is a state-owned enterprise, certainly there will be a specific set of priorities that needs to be looked into. From the perspective of keeping the engagement asks robust and purposeful, again, we will reiterate the need to reference the benchmark, because in particular, when an investor is to consider other options to engage, to put on the table, referencing the benchmark is highly recommended as a tool. And also, in order to maximize the impact of the engagement, collaborative engagement, especially taking note of the synergy between local and international investors, that certainly is also something that we are quite keen to emphasize on. So on my final slide here, ultimately, I think what's important is that, as alluded to at the beginning, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We need to explore all forms of engagement and to see how they're complementary to each other. And so when we look at that, we also need to understand a company's influence along the value chain, their commitment to decarbonize. All of that will help us identify what engagement approach is the most appropriate. From the market's perspective, there could be different stewardship practices. So by introducing some measures, it could mean that there is a level of novelty involved in the method. And so we need to constantly test that method and recalibrate on the engagement tactic in the next time around. And so I think I'm almost at time. So just basically weighing all of these considerations to arrive at a decision as to if and when tabling different engagement approaches is helpful to an engagement, including supporting shareholder resolutions on climate change, and having investors have a clear voting principle on climate. I think that will be helpful considerations. And I think I'll leave it at that here. And next, let Elizabeth take us through the report in the next segment that we'll be launching today. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Valerie. Very insightful, very helpful. Many thanks to you for that incredible presentation. As Valerie mentioned, we will be moving on now next to the official launch of Net Zero Engagement in Asia, a guide to shareholder climate resolutions. Elizabeth Wu, legal consultant, Asia Climate and Energy of ClientEarth, will be sharing with us high-level insights from expert contributors to the guide. I am now delighted to hand the reins over to Elizabeth.
I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today for the participation in this particular launch on net zero engagements. I'll just be a little quicker than to not go into the time of the panelists themselves. So just very, very proud to present Net Zero Engagement in Asia, a guide to shareholder climate resolutions, which is a collaboration between ClientEarth and AIGCC. Now, this guide is a resource for Asia-focused investors considering shareholder resolutions as a complement to broader engagement options when exercising responsible stewardship on climate matters. This guide showcases the views of local experts on the landscape for shareholder climate resolutions across 11 Asian jurisdictions. And it is very much meant as a broader complement to stewardship options, calibrated, of course, as what is appropriate or complementary to each engagement and within a specific local context. Now, the guide is a high-level reference and is not legal advice for any specific case, but hopefully a helpful resource to investors. Now, this guide is published amidst a broader trend of an increase in environmental shareholder resolutions globally. As of 2022, 146 environmental shareholder resolutions were subject to a vote around the world. And research from BlackRock has also shown that for companies in the United States, companies tend to meet the request made in a shareholder resolution if it receives significant support. And this is very much regardless whether or not the resolution passes. So research has shown, for instance, that for shareholder resolutions that receive 30% to 50% support, 67% have resulted in companies fully or partially meeting the ask of the shareholder resolution. Now, closer to home, we are very deeply grateful to the expert contributors from 11 jurisdictions in Asia who have contributed to the guide. The experts come from top law firms across Asia, and they include leaders and senior members of the legal fraternity in their respective jurisdictions. We are very privileged to have with us one such member, Topuan Janet Lui, who is the senior partner and head of corporate and co-head of the ESG practice of top Malaysian law firm Screen, who will be on the upcoming panel discussion, and we look forward to a very lively panel discussion later. Now, the expert contributors to the guide provide insights on the landscape of shareholder climate resolutions in each jurisdiction. Each jurisdiction's expert also provides a brief summary of key developments that are relevant to climate risk and ESG in 2021 to 2022 in that particular jurisdiction, so that investor engagement is very much situated within its appropriate local context. In terms of definition then, what exactly is a shareholder climate resolution? Now, shareholder climate resolutions are understood and defined in the guide as shareholder filed resolutions which concern a company's governance, disclosure or business strategy on climate change, and which can complement other stewardship options. Now, the slide has some non-exhaustive examples of this, and obviously it's not meant to encompass the very different types of resolutions that can be crafted depending on each specific company situation. If you can see, the first example is that of a call for increased transparency and disclosure by the company in question. Then you have potentially the setting of an ambition or making of a commitment by the company to become a net zero business in the scope of their 1 to 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Development by the company of a Paris-aligned strategy or transition plan with different time-bound goals, providing shareholders with the opportunity to approve or to vote down the terms or implementation of a company's strategy or transition plan, and disclosure by the company of details of their climate and energy policy lobbying, advertising, and advocacy activities. Now, some common questions that are addressed by the expert contributors to the guide are on the slide here. Basic right to file really means do shareholders have the basic right to propose a shareholder climate resolution? The legal process for this really differs amongst jurisdictions. It can range from tabling a shareholder climate resolution for consideration at an upcoming shareholders meeting to calling a shareholders meeting to specifically consider the resolution. In terms of amendment to charter documents, this really means whether it is either required or recommended that the shareholder climate resolution be framed as an amendment to the company's charter documents. And if so, how would this be recommended to be framed? For types of shareholder resolutions available and voting thresholds, this really sets out the types of resolutions that are available in the applicable jurisdiction: ordinary, special, or advisory. And this is important because the concept of an advisory or non-binding resolution does not exist in all jurisdictions. It also sets out, the guide also sets out the proportion of votes that's required for each particular type of resolution to pass. Thresholds of filing a resolution and calling a meeting is really about whether or not what particular thresholds there may be and what particular date at which this threshold is to be calculated. And process and formal requirements for filing a resolution or proposing a meeting really means what are the types of requirements and processes in the forms of delivery methods, forms of the request, signature of the request, and language of the request, as well as recipients at the company in terms of the process. As for how the company must respond, this is really to see how the company needs to address such a call for a resolution, whether a call for a meeting is necessary, and also who bears the cost of such response. And of course, whether a resolution can be withdrawn is rather self-explanatory. Now, across jurisdictions, what is quite striking is how different local experts' analysis has been and how uniquely different each legal landscape is, although shareholder climate resolutions can be proposed in all 11 jurisdictions. In terms of whether a shareholder climate resolution falls within the normal matters that shareholders can bring resolutions on, this itself differs across jurisdictions. For example, in the People's Republic of China, generally, the experts have actually the experts have stated that shareholders have rights to propose and vote on shareholder climate resolutions and receive protection of such rights under PRC law. And the range of matters that shareholders can file resolutions and vote on is wide, and they include decisions on the business policies and investment plans of the company. So effectively, a shareholder climate resolution in this jurisdiction can, in general cases, be filed as a ordinary resolution. In Hong Kong, experts observed that generally shareholders can bring resolutions on a wide range of matters, including shareholder climate resolutions. And this is unless it is specifically prohibited by the company's articles of association. If the company has not adopted such specific articles, Hong Kong law stipulates that model articles of association apply as a default, and these contain no restrictions on the bringing of shareholder climate resolutions. In Vietnam, experts have observed that generally, if the subject matter of a shareholder climate resolution results in a change to the existing contents of the charter, such as the company's business lines, then the resolution should be framed as an amendment to the charter. As for India, experts observe that generally the company's charter must expressly permit a shareholder climate resolution to be brought, or else amendment to the charter is needed. Finally, another last example on this slide is really with Japan. And Japan's expert has observed that generally a shareholder climate resolution would not normally fall within the matters that shareholders can consider. This is unless the articles of incorporation allow shareholders to bring such resolutions. And if so, and if not, the proposed shareholder climate resolution has to be in the form of an amendment to the articles of incorporation so that the climate objective itself is part of the articles. Shareholder climate resolutions are brought in Japan predominantly in this form, and this has been what the expert has observed. So, and I think because I'm running out of time, the diversity of approaches, I think just to wrap up, the diversity of approaches in Asia makes it imperative that investors who are considering filing a resolution obtain bespoke and legal and other types of advice, because in all cases, filing a shareholder climate resolution should be viewed within the broader context of the range of complementary stewardship options that investors can consider when engaging with companies. And Valerie has gone through some, and Rebecca has outlined a couple of these. And in all cases, as appropriate to each engagement. So ClientEarth and AIGCC hope that this particular guide on shareholder climate resolutions will very much complement the broader range of options that investors have when exercising responsible stewardship. So thank you very much for your time, and I will hand over to the panel presentation and discussion now.
Massive thanks to you, Elizabeth, for giving us that glimpse into this guide, and we highly encourage all investors to have a look at this very insightful piece of resource. Now, I am delighted to say that we're going to head over to our panel discussion next. The topic that they will be talking about today is what engagement options and approaches are investors considering to enable effective, robust, and impactful engagement with companies in Asia on climate issues. Now, this discussion will be moderated by Rebecca McCullough-Wright, CEO of AIGCC, and she will be joined by 4 panel speakers. I'm so happy to introduce them to you. First and foremost, we have Drew Al-Qayyam, Global ESG Analyst, Legal and General Investment Management. We also have Top One Janet Louis, Senior Partner, Head of the Corporate Division and Co-Head of ESG Practice Group at Scrine. We also have Yu Kyung Park, Head of the Global Responsible Investment and Governance Asia Pacific Team, APG Asset Management Asia. And last but not least, we also have Sachi Suzuki, Senior Stewardship Specialist, HSBC Asset Management. So I hope I pronounced all your names correctly. I'm now going to pass the time over to Rebecca to moderate the session. Rebecca, it's back over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Colette, and thank you so much to Valerie and Elizabeth for really setting the scene for the panel discussion that we're going to have now, and really there's a lot to unpack in both of those reports. So we've now got a good piece of time to really ask some questions. I do encourage you to put your questions into the chat. And as I've got some questions to kick off with the panelists that we can start off with. And then we'll come to your questions as well. So please do send them through. So perhaps I'll start, Janet, with you. So I'm keen for you to share some observations on directors' duties that they have on overseeing climate change risks and around their fiduciary obligations. How can this sort of shape how shareholders engage with companies' management? And what kind of examples of regulations and rules and guidance that shape this kind of engagement?
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you to AIGCC and ClientEarth for this opportunity to share. So we've talked about in the past presentations and in your opening comments and Ikeda-san's comments, of course, about investor engagement, and investor engagement then will turn on also what investors can expect from the directors. And in terms of directors' duties then, while there are many different laws and different scenarios for the different companies in Asian jurisdictions, being so many jurisdictions, both common law and civil law, there are some commonalities, and I will, for the purpose of this discussion, focus on the commonalities. So the director's duties in general are divided into the duty to act for proper purpose in good faith and in the best interest of the company, and also a duty to exercise reasonable care, skill, and diligence. And in terms of the jurisdiction, some examples of where these will appear, for example, in Malaysia, we both have common law and the statutes expressing these duties. And we also have in Hong Kong, the duty to exercise care, skill, and diligence, also in their statutes in the Hong Kong Companies Ordinance, Chapter 622, and the Singapore Companies Act, Chapter 50. In the civil law jurisdictions, using Japan as an example, the Companies Act of Japan and the Civil Code also talk about a duty of loyalty to act in the company's best interests, and the duty to comply with all laws and regulations, and also a duty of care. So we can see much similarities there. And in terms of setting the stage for what directors have to do then, and what investors can expect, when they discharge their duties of fiduciary duties and the duty to act in reasonable care, we know now that ESG and climate change is really a top corporate agenda for investors and stakeholders. And of course, we also know that many countries have, including those in Asia, have made national commitments, pledging carbon neutrality by 2050, for example. And regulators have recognized climate change now as a material financial risk. And this would mean that there are requirements for disclosure of climate and sustainability related disclosures, as well as requirements for directors to ensure that the audited accounts and reports are not misleading. And just very quickly on what the national motions have been. Malaysia, for example, has committed to a 45% reduction of GHGs by 2030 and to become carbon neutral as early as 2050. And, China and Japan also have theirs, as well as Singapore, Thailand, and Indonesia. And in Singapore, there is also a carbon tax regime that has been implemented. And this also will play into the requirements for directors. So what does this mean for engagement by investors? The question then is whether directors have properly discharged their duties. And in Malaysia, for example, a federal court decision which takes on board all of the common law UK decisions, Charter Bridge, for example, Charter Bridge Principle, they have said that there are two aspects. One is an objective test. The courts will review whether an honest and intelligent man in the position of the director could, in the whole of those circumstances, have believed that, this decision was for the best interest of the company. But then they will also look at whether the director himself considers that decision to be in the best interest of the company from a subjective test perspective. This brings me to very quickly touching on the business judgment rule. So for the purpose of the directors, obviously, many matters are best decided by the directors, by the companies. And courts in general are very reluctant to interfere with the merits of a director's decision if he is able, in this context, to demonstrate that climate risks have been considered. But he must also show that the business judgment was exercised for a proper purpose and in good faith. And importantly, he must be informed about the subject matter at hand, such that he can make a reasonably good decision. And in terms of Asia and decisions around the world and the director's duties, the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative did commission some legal opinions, and in jurisdictions from Malaysia, Canada, US, India, Singapore, Hong Kong, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and including Japan. So civil and common law jurisdictions all are agreed that directors are duty-bound to take into account climate change aspects in their decision-making. And in terms of the regulators' requirements, again, I'll stop here as the last comment. But the Malaysian corporate code of corporate governance, for example, in Malaysia, has made it very clear that the board leadership is expected for integration of sustainability and climate change risk into corporate strategy, governance, and decision making. And we have similar pronouncements from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and the Hong Kong Securities Commission, for example, have, in a slightly different angle and pertinent to this discussion, issued a circular to ESG funds to disclose investment strategies, proportion of ESG assets, and associated risks. And on a final comment, there have been central banks around the world, including Bank Negara, who have issued an exposure draft on climate risk management. And I know that there are other monetary authorities that have done this, requiring boards of financial institutions to have overall responsibility to safeguard FI's resilience against adverse impacts of climate change. And this would mean that boards will have to look into this to ensure that they are able to get financing or get financing at competitive rates.
Thank you so much, Janet. That's really fascinating, and I think it's just you've summarised and really taken us around the world and given us a really strong picture of what are these expectations and really pointing out those commonalities, as you said at the beginning, and really that the director's duties, and while there obviously are this increasing regulatory environment that they're facing, and arguably that's been moving quite quickly, especially in the Asia region, but we've certainly seen in many markets that have identified this director's duty link, that it was within existing duties and not necessary sort of new duties around climate change, but it was actually bound within existing those duties that were already there. So,
exactly.
So thank you. I think that's a great way to just kick us off and frame the conversation there. Dror, I'm keen to bring you in here, and I guess we've heard about some of the expectations that investors have on companies, including against obviously the Climate Action 100 benchmark, for example. But before we get into any sort of kind of escalation discussion, I'm just keen to just sort of set the scene a little bit about engagement and how you approach this. Would you be able to walk us through your sort of how you screen your portfolio companies, a little bit about your engagement strategy, and some of the options that that LGIM would explore if a company's performance on climate falls short of expectations, for example, and how do you consider that? Keen for you to share that with us.
Sure, thank you, Rebecca. I think firstly I should mention that sustainability of the ESG landscape has been evolving quite rapidly in the last 5 to 10 years. And as a result, investors' expectations from companies, including LGIMs, have also increased over time, as we now have more tools, to assess companies' performance and identify, the gaps which we consider to be material for the specific business. So, some of these key areas that we've seen a gradual change or improvement on our disclosure of ESG data, which has become better. There is a better product offering by third-party providers, for example, and I'm not just talking about ESG scores. The tightening regulatory environment leads to more transparency, and also, consolidation of some widely used framework to ensure that reporting, is aligned with business materiality. For example, if we take the ISSB. Now, we are tracking progress of these specific components to really evolve our thinking and approach on social, governance, and indeed environmental issues, which, as we know, are closely related to climate change, which we believe to be one of the most defining, issues of our time. So, for us at LGIM, we utilize all the above, really, in our assessment process of companies, including engagements, which is a very, very important, aspect of our work. So, for example, when it comes to evaluating a company's strategy in terms of its energy transition, then we refer to the IEA net zero scenarios, right, and how the targets set by the companies are indeed aligned with this 1.5 degree trajectory. Also, I think that we ought to be transparent with the market. So, we laid out our criteria for supporting management proposed climate transition plans earlier in the year, and what we expect them to include, to warrant LGIM support, which is primarily around disclosure and target settings with, short, medium, and long-term milestones, covering scope 1, 2, and material 3 emissions, in line with the 1.5 degree pathway, which, as we know, can be quite challenging, really, in some climate critical sectors. And I think also, in order to communicate or engage in scale, then we often initiate some campaigns around, for example, transparency or diversity, where we use the data we collect on companies to identify companies falling behind these market standards or our expectations, which, by the way, we set publicly and communicate with the companies themselves. And with the stick sort of being applied is the voting sanctions that can result if insufficient progress around these issues isn't being made. And lastly, and I'm conscious that I can go on for the entire day talking about it, but I mentioned previously ESG scores. So I think many investors do their own scores, but LGIM as well, and we're currently using 30 different indicators across the ESG and even transparency, which we collect from a number of providers to really to rate companies, and with the aim to publish these scores twice a year, to raise market standards, and to also for companies who are who we invest in, which is pretty much every company under the sun, and unable to engage with, because we cannot engage with every company we invest in. So for the companies to be aware of, and see under which topics they are sort of like falling behind, which also emphasize the importance, of IR functions or company secretary functions to engage with these providers, just to ensure that the data being collected on them is accurate and timely. So our scores do have implications, Rebecca, on capital allocation, as holdings in a growing subset of our funds are tilted towards the better ESG performers. And there are other climate-specific engagement campaigns which result in voting sanctions and divestments, which I'm happy to cover later on during the session.
Thanks, Dror. If I could just quickly follow up, I'm keen to, I'm sure there's a broad range, but I'm just keen to get a bit of a sense of the feedback from companies on the type of campaign that you have. It's quite public. Yeah, I'm keen to just, what's some of the feedback that you've had on your approach in Asia?
Well, I think companies appreciate the transparency, and because we do aim to provide the companies our assessment process, how we measure them, how we measure the performance, it's all publicly communicated. And we also provide, for example, if we take the ESG scores, then we also provide the actual data providers, for each and every indicator which the company is being assessed on. So, and many times, Rebecca, we also hear from companies, the comment you just said about we should talk to data providers. this is actually a very, very good tip because, you know, often, and I used to work for one myself, you know, often as a company reach out to the Bloomberg, the Sustainalytics, the MSCI of the world, and challenge them about the data they collect on them. Often this data can be revised and, you know, consequently, you know, being used or utilized more accurately by the investors.
Great, thank you. And look, it is at the end of the day, it has to be a collaborative approach across all actors, investors, companies, the data providers. Everybody needs to be part of this solution. So, and so I think it's through this dialogue that can be really useful, as you described, for investors to share some of their thoughts, suggestions that they might have, you know, used elsewhere for these companies. So it needs to be, it's obviously a constant iteration if we're going to meet the challenge that the climate crisis presents to us. So Sashi, I'm keen to bring you in here. So from your perspective, so before you might look to file a shareholder resolution, what are some of the other tools you would consider in principle, voting against directors or other complementary actions, you know, communications with the company?
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, I think as I mentioned earlier, shareholder proposal is typically an escalation tool. So we would assume that there would have been some actions in the run-up to the filing, but it would depend on each investor and each, you know, company situation and what's going on in the market, really. But I think that typically an investor would seek a dialogue with the company and ideally at senior management or board level. And you might start as one-on-one engagement, and as part of the escalation, you know, join a collaborative effort with other investors through organized group or sort of a more informal basis. And then depending on a company's response, so if some companies may completely be, you know, unresponsive, not willing to engage at all, then that's already a past block. So that could potentially, you know, lead to more radical action sooner. But even if the company is, you know, open to engagement, a lot of them are very defensive. Might not be, you know, willing to accommodate investors' requests, and without really, you know, providing a valid, convincing explanation of why they wouldn't do, then again that could lead to further escalation. And the escalation can take different, you know, forms. It could be some investors might first resort to a public open letter, for example, or naming and the company in public domain somehow. But also, I think then shareholder proposal is another option. But before going into actually filing, I think it would be probably, it would make sense to write a formal letter of sort of a warning to the senior management or the chair of the board, and list key asks, so what exactly you need to see by which date, and waiting that could, you know, result in potential shareholder proposals. Then this sort of warning I have seen happening at a few companies, and at that point some companies have responded in more, you know, specific and meaningful way to, and may not change the target or whatever asked straight away, but they would commit to doing so with a specific deadline. Then investors would not go ahead with a proposal. So this kind of a negotiation is really important. And also would be another an idea to use voting rights in the run-up to the filing, depending on the timing of the AGMs, EGMs. But many investors, including ourselves, have voting policy, proxy voting policy, incorporating climate and other types of issues, not just traditional governance issues. So we would vote against companies, chair or the relevant directors if the company doesn't meet a minimum expectations on climate change, diversity, human rights, and various other issues. So that could, that sort of votes against could be a warning far in advance of these actions.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. And on that note around voting against directors, YK, how have you been? How's APG been exercising your voting rights around directors' votes? Yeah, keen to hear from you on this, and it'd be good if you sort of describe a little bit about you know, voting in dissent and the company response to that, and other types of complementary actions as well.
Yeah, so we've been sending negative votes, very unhappy. So that some companies actually take it very personally. So, I mean, which is good, because at least we have some response from the company. But I think my the experience is that, let's say, just sending votes, even though it's negative votes, it's not really impactful in my view. So let's say, depending on the market as well. So let's say Korea. Companies do not disclose voting rights. They're not required. So that it's pass or not pass is important. So that, you know, once, you know, the resolution is passed, then yeah, it's passed, so that they don't look back. Japan, they disclose, they're required to disclose, but Japan is largely considered as cross-shareholding market. So that, you know, the chance for investors to actually succeed by voting against, actually it's quite low. So that the impact is actually limited, but Japan is better than South Korea. Many other markets, in my view, pass is pass. So, and then also I think that the board has no practice that, let's say, there is no deep contemplation over dissent votes. So that if it is, let's say, so in Australia or advanced markets, for example, the board will actually think about if they have, let's say, 20% is, you know, against votes, right, or plus, they will think about it, why so many investors have voted against. In Asia, I think that practice is not really well in place. So that's one of the difficulties actually I face utilizing the vote. So we have to do something else. So the something else is, let's say before, I mean, we collectively, we should actually utilize the annual shareholders meeting season more, you know, cleverly. So for example, before AGM, we need to have a calculated actions. So for example, we need to meet with, let's say, board members. Before, let's say, very important board meeting, we should ask, let's say, okay, we want to meet with board member, you know, especially independent board members or member, the chair of sustainability committee, or et cetera, and then prior, so just before AGM meeting, we can actually send a letter or send an email, or et cetera, asking, could you please address this climate change issues during the, you know, annual shareholders meeting, so that, you know, that is actually said and all the shareholders actually have a chance to listen to, and go to AGM and speak and ask questions. And then also, I think that the last resort might be a shareholder proposal.
Do you think, speaking at AGMs, for example, like, do you think this is starting to get a bit more accepted in Asia now? Where is that up to at the moment?
Yeah, so I think Korea is now well set. So it used to be, I think when was the first time I went to AGM? I think about 5 years ago. I was actually, a lot of people, you know, investors in South Korea, they don't go to AGM. Is for a formality. So 99% of the people are employees. So you know, investors are not expected to be there. So 5 years ago, wasn't like that, but including APG, a lot, you know, many investors tend to go now, so that it's okay. You're not like very strange animal there. Everybody look at, so that's okay. Japan is actually very tough. Japan is very tough. So that I have been actually advised so many times that you don't go to AGM. You will be seen as activist shareholders. But you know, the commercial code said that you can actually go. No, you don't. So that there are a lot of unwritten rules that prevent investors from going, just simply going, attending the shareholders meeting. So I think that's really tough in my view.
Yeah, I mean, and that really goes to the different, there's sort of the rules and the regulations, and then there's obviously that cultural aspect that's very much there as well, and what's sort of considered acceptable and so on. And to your point on, you know, the increasing escalation over time and companies in Asia not responding to that in some markets, I think, you know, there's a number of cases, you know, this year, for example, in the Australian market, just last week, in fact, of AGL, a utility, having increasing votes against directors in recent years, which led to the appointment of 4 new directors this year, specifically to be more aligned and to really bolster their climate change, their climate action plan and so on. So very clear signal from investors that built up over the last couple of years. And obviously we have, you know, Exxon as well, another international example. YK, what are some other forms of escalation you've used in Asian markets? And do you feel that do you need to use sort of dual approaches, or you know, can you use dual approaches in your escalation? I'm keen to just explore, to hear a little bit more about that from you.
Yeah, so I totally really agree with what the shareholders already spoke. Let's say shareholder proposal must do. I mean, this is not until when we are going to have a pointless same kind of discussions or meetings with IR department. So I mean, if you actually, we already experienced, right? Having a good meeting with IR is very good, but we experienced that some of the you know, company representatives actually have a very specific goal. The goal is actually to shut investors. So that in that sense, right? So it continues to have like same discussion, same defense from the company. It's actually no use. So then what else then can we do? It's a shareholder proposal. Shareholder proposal is, let's say, you know, the shareholder proposal is recommending directors so that the base is board renewal, so that the board is not good enough, so that, you know, companies need to renew, and then holding directors accountable when they make wrong decisions. For example, in 2021, 2022, they still go ahead with coal power plant, you know, coal-fired power plant investment. Then, I mean, those directors need to be responsible for that kind of decision. So that's that. And then the next one will be, let's say, derivatives actions, and sometimes maybe class actions can be considered. And I think what is important is actually escalation is important. When we have just, you know, same discussion over and over and over, companies very happy for 10 years doing the same thing. So escalation is actually very important, no other choice.
Yes, well, certainly the climate impacts are escalating, and really we need to match that. You know, we need to see the action that and because the companies are being affected, and investors want to understand how the companies will, you know, being affected on the risk side, but what are the opportunities and how they are going to effectively transition. And so this is what this dialogue needs to be about. So Sachi, just coming back to you, I'm keen to ask you to share you know, some examples of filing a climate resolution in Asia, and what were some of the key considerations that you needed to consider, and perhaps some of the barriers that had to be overcome before, you know, making that decision to you know, to file a resolution.
Sure. We co-filed a set of climate resolutions proposals at J-Power in Japan this year. So I can really mainly talk about Japan. We worked with AIGCC and Man Group and Amandi. So this was the first investor-led climate resolution, investor group-led climate proposals filed in Japan. So we made a big news in Japan. And we asked for the companies to set a Paris-aligned carbon reduction targets, and assessment of CapEx alignment, and also reporting on how executive pay incentivizes these goal achieving these goals targets. So before we decide to go ahead with the filing, but we joined the engagement group first. So it is a sort of mixed. The different questions you ask were to different levels, but you need to consider what, key messages of the potential filing, or what the engagement objectives of this group, and if they are aligned with our, broader strategic priorities and engagement objectives, and also looking at the potential co-filers and the people we would be working with. Do we have common objectives? Are they credible? And also for more sort of practical considerations, impact on our work, but also, co-filing could be seen as quite still aggressive, unfortunately, in many markets. So if we are seen as labeled as some sort of activist investor, then would that make our future work difficult in those markets? So these are risks you need to consider and then balance before you head. And obviously more sort of practical consideration of resources and time commitment, impact on other work that you do. It's very, very time consuming. Again, depending on the market, what paperwork is needed will be different. But it is time consuming, so it's a big consideration. You wouldn't want to sign up too many, co-filing projects in one proxy season unless you have a huge team. And you obviously have to go through internal approval process and explain it to people who are not necessarily familiar with these markets or the processes, and speaking with legal team, compliance team, and a risk to provide assurance and consider all the factors. That's the internal process. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of paperwork that's needed, and especially in Japan, some of the requirements are, many of them actually are based on the local legal practices, and some of the documents we had to submit were essentially substituting something that would only really exist in Japan. So it's really fine, I think, decision making involved, and you really need a good legal advice. And it's great that this guide you just launched has a list of legal experts in each market. And we, in our case, we worked with Shinsuke, who wrote this Japan chapter, and he was excellent. And so for each market, I think you really need specialist lawyer who is supportive and efficient.
Great, thank you. Draw, just bringing you in here on this, what do you think an effective climate resolution should look like?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on many variables, and I would definitely echo what Sachi just said about the resource and all the work that has to be done before you even submit the proposal. But generally speaking, I think the proposal has to be tailored to the specific asks that from the company, whether if it's around disclosure or actions that we believe are vital in the context of the business, while at the same time isn't overly prescriptive. So ideally a shareholder resolution should be filed also following ongoing engagements with the company on these related gaps. I think YK mentioned this is an escalation step, not just I think for Elgin, but for many investors. So if we talk about Elgin specific approach, it's definitely an escalation step if engagements haven't yield the right results. I think there were also mentioned some regional considerations here, and it's also important to note, because we know that in certain regions and sectors it is more challenging to transition, right? And the differentiation between emerging and developed market should be made here. But it also should be noted that some jurisdictions make it a bit more challenging to file at. So I think from our point of view, it's really imperative to have support from a wide group of stakeholders, if it's NGOs, law firms, think tanks, in addition to investors and asset owners who essentially lend or stake they have in the company. I think in order to really overcome all these obstacles that Sachi has mentioned, which investors are normally unaware of, or just in assistance with. And this kind of like cross collaboration, I think, is really key to ensure a successful campaign, which by the way doesn't have to result in actually filing against the company, if indeed the company has agreed or committed to meet the asks from the investors following these engagements up until the AGM. And just the last point I want to make is just to point out that filing a proposal is a resource extensive process that for investors. So we often need to prioritize quality and strategic impact that we want to make, as opposed to filing a large volume of shareholders of resolutions. So really quality over quantity, and I think a successful or well supported resolution can really result in not only positive impact for the company specifically, but also in the context of the market, as we can really raise market standards as a whole, if and encourage companies in this industry, in these regions, to take similar actions. Because as I mentioned before or previously, I think this trend that we've seen in the market of increasing volume of shareholder proposals, climate-related shareholder proposals, should be taken very seriously, by companies. So understand, how your shareholder base evolves, in order to develop the business in line with market expectations. Because if you don't really, then you will be eventually exposing yourself to the same level of risks.
Great, thank you. And YK, just to sort of finish off on this, what are the kinds of resolutions you think that would garner the most support and get the most traction to help, push this engagement along?
I think the shareholder proposal threshold is very important. So I think some countries like India, threshold is 10% too high. I don't know Australia. I forgot Australia is 5% or something. So and Japan in that sense it's very low, and South Korea is 0.5%. In general, so that it's a threshold is low. That's really helpful. So that investors then can take. Japan, like as I mentioned, unwritten rules and culture. So that's really preventing. So that if so, I think Takeda-san is. I'm hoping he's still here. If you can, as a regulator, can solve this problem. There's a law and written, but that is actually different from what it compared to unwritten rules. I think that is something that regulators and investors can actually change over time. Yeah, activist shareholders is not all bad. So activist shareholders can bring good changes in a very quick time. So that I think that perception should be changed and it can be changed. That would be great. That would be one of the FSA's biggest victory if that happens.
Great, thanks YK. And we are seeing this change, and in the region we are seeing this acceptance and through this dialogue that it is investors do want this partnership and ultimately want the same outcome for their companies that they're part owners of. They want sustainable long-term returns. So they sort of ultimately do have the same the same objective as the company, but it's making sure those objectives are aligned, especially on the climate front, of course.